Hey there, Political Science 100. This is the first chapter of the class in the textbook, and the book is called The Logic of American Politics, and so is this chapter. And it's a pretty important chapter because it lays out a lot of the fundamental framework about the logic of American politics. And it makes the case that there is, despite how it might seem to you at times, an actual logic, an underlying logic to the way our political system works. And it introduces a lot of fundamental concepts that will run throughout the text. So it's pretty important that we understand this stuff. Some of the main themes of the chapter include the importance of institutions in the design of a government, how the way our institutions are designed themselves affects the way government functions. We get into the role of the Constitution in establishing rules and procedures that are to be followed to reach collective agreements, and we'll talk about what collective agreements are. Collective agreements pose some problems. Those are called collective action problems, and understanding what those are and how the institutions of a government are designed to address those problems is key to understanding how a political system functions. Tackling problems of collective action, and again, we'll get into in a bit what these terms mean. Addressing these problems of collective action entails some costs, so we'll talk about those. And then we'll close with a little bit of discussion leading into the next section about what the founders were thinking, the founders of American democracy, primarily people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, what they were thinking in terms of how to address the collective action problems that they recognized as taking place at the founding of our country. So I want to open up with just some fundamental points about why we form societies in the first place. And I think that it's may seem pretty obvious to you, but it's worth thinking about for a second. What would life be like if we didn't? What if we all lived as isolated individual hermits rather than enjoying the benefits of living in a community? What if every time you went somewhere, you had to build your own road to get there? Like literally take out whatever tools you would need, paving and construction tools, to build a road to get to a place you wanted to go. Never mind the existence of places we would want to go, which themselves are the product of joint efforts, communal efforts, but just getting there. I mean, clearly, we recognize the benefits of banding together, pooling our resources, and living in what we call a community, a society, because we don't have to build our own roads. We can all team up and build roads and a transportation system one time, and then we all get to use it thereon after. So for a variety of reasons, and that's just one small example, if you start thinking about all the things that societies do, you can see many other benefits of living in a community versus living in a life of an isolated hermit. But getting those things done, doing those things, poses some very significant challenges. Who in the community does what? How do we agree on what we're going to do as a society? How do we coordinate our efforts to do those kinds of things? How do we ensure, once we've decided we want to do something, build a road, build a school, defend ourselves, have a functioning economic system, have a transportation system, combat a pandemic, after we've decided we want to do those things, assuming we can get to that step, how do we enforce compliance with the agreements that we've arrived at communally to do those things? These are fundamental challenges that every society faces. Another fundamental challenge in a reality of life is conflict. When we have choices among a large number of people, there are going to be differences of opinion on the best course of action, the best options among those choices. We have conflicting interests. What is in my interest may not necessarily be in your interests. We have conflicting values. I value certain things that you may not value as highly, and vice versa. We certainly have conflicting ideas about how to allocate scarce resources. There aren't enough to go around for everyone to have as much as he or she would want of all the things that exist in the world. This reality of conflict as a part of life was a point that James Madison, who's one of the fundamental architects of our Constitution, talked about in some essays that we'll get into later in the class, the Federalist Papers. In Federalist number 10, Madison wrote that a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppose each other than to cooperate for the common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. In modern English, we like to fight. We're a conflictual species. And that last point he's making is that usually we have plenty of important things to fight about, but even absent something important to fight about, we'll come up with the stupidest stuff to fight about. We'll fight about Ohio State versus Michigan, Lakers versus Celtics. We'll come up with anything. Politics is the process of dealing with these things, dealing with those differences in values and allocation of scarce resources and settling on conflicts. An informal definition of politics is simply who gets what. The text defines it more formally as politics is the process through which individuals and groups reach agreement on a course of common or collective action, even as they disagree on the intended goals of that action. So there's two parts there. It's the process through which we come to agreement on a course of action for tackling these issues, these conflicts, these questions about values and resources. Knowing, however, that we disagree on what the intended goals or the outcomes that we desire are. Politics is not about arriving at consensus. It's not about unanimity on goals. It's not about convincing everyone to want the same thing. That's impossible. As Madison pointed out, we are too conflictual. It's a process. Politics is the process of deciding things given that we disagree on the goals or the ends. Understanding that we're not going to be on the same page, we at least have to come up with some sort of solution for arriving at a decision, knowing that we're not all going to be happy with that decision. Political solutions almost always require some degree of bargaining and compromise. And of course, the extent to which there is bargaining and compromise is tied to the type of political system you have. There's much more need for that in a democracy than there is in a dictatorship, of course. That point we'll get to in just a second. There's a big difference in the setting in terms of the necessity of politics and how easy it is to arrive at political solutions. In small-scale settings, in family settings, and in small group settings, political solutions are pretty easily arrived at. The bargaining that's required is pretty informal. Usually it's just conversations. Generally, there's greater trust among the parties. You know the people that you're working with. And reneging on the agreements is noticeable. It's punishable. If you live in a roommate situation, say you're renting a house with 4 roommates, and you have to do things like make sure the dishes are done and the house is cleaned and groceries are bought and those kinds of things. Those are political situations in a sense that you don't all necessarily agree on who should do what should be bought, how it should all be handled. But you can bargain through those things. You can arrive at solutions to those political problems just through conversations. Again, you know your roommates. There's presumably some level of trust. If someone doesn't live up to their expectations and that trust is broken, you can notice it. You can see who didn't do the dishes at any one time, and it's punishable. So in a small-scale setting, political solutions are pretty easy. But once you ramp up the size, once you go from a roommate situation to a community, never mind a nation of 330 million people, the number of participants involved increases and the issues get much more complex. And this sort of informal bargaining is completely impractical. It's impossible. It becomes also all but impossible, if not literally impossible, to notice when someone reneges on an agreement. So given that this informal bargaining doesn't work anymore and you can't really see in a sea of 300 million people who's living up to and not living up to their end of the agreement, we need to find more formal, established ways of deciding things, of doing things. And when you talk about more established ways of deciding things in a nation, that's when you get into formal structures that we see in political systems. So a government, for example, consists of the institutions and the procedures through which people are ruled. And those institutions and procedures include offices that have authority and power, and those things are usually set forth in a constitution. A constitution is a document that outlines the institutions of government, and it specifies the uses and limits of the powers of those institutions. Institutions are organizations that manage potential conflicts between political rivals and help them find mutually acceptable solutions and make and enforce society's collective agreements. Another way to think of institutions is established ways of processing our disagreements, channels through which we know we can hash out these disagreements. So in the American political system, we have established institutions such as the legislative branch of government, the executive branch of government, the judicial branch of government. And through these branches of government, these institutions of government, these established processes, we have a system for debating and passing legislation and executing that legislation and ruling on the legality or constitutionality of that legislation. So those are the kinds of things that I mean when I talk about established ways of doing things that are necessary in a large-scale society that are not necessary in small settings. You probably don't have to have a government or a constitution or established institutions in your 5-person roommate situation. If you do, it's probably overkill. But in a nation of 300 million people, you do need those things to handle political problems. One way to judge the effectiveness of a government is to see how well its institutions are handling its politics. A major theme in the next couple of sections of the class, will have to do with the complete inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation, our original governing document, our original Constitution, in handling the basic political challenges that were confronting the newly formed United States, and how much better the Constitution did at handling those problems. We might look at American politics today and ask how well our institutions are handling the challenges that are facing us today. And I think an honest look at that would say not too well. There are a lot of Americans that have lost faith in American institutions, from electoral institutions to the judicial system and so on. And so because of that loss of faith and perceived and perhaps real loss of effectiveness of the institutions in handling our problems, our country and democracy is facing some real challenges. Let's talk about some of the terms that are going to run through this class. The first of which is collective action. Collective action is the efforts of groups to reach and to implement and to enforce agreements. So all the reasons that we build societies for in the first place, why we live in these communal settings as opposed to isolation. We're better off at defending ourselves when we pool our resources collectively. We can build roads and a system of transportation infrastructure. We can do simple things like deliver the mail. We can do very complicated things like confront a pandemic. All of those things require collective action. They require efforts across a large number of people to accomplish these agreed upon goals. Collective action poses some problems, though, and addressing those problems is a fundamental challenge that every society faces. The first of those problems is coordination, and the coordination problem is successfully coordinating, obviously, the group effort, deciding what the group wants and figuring out who's going to do what to make that happen. And again, in small-scale settings, this isn't too difficult. It's usually handled pretty informally. If the situation is you live in a neighborhood and you're one of several parents and you have kids that need to get to school and you want to set up some sort of carpool system where you rotate driving the kids to school, you can coordinate how that's going to happen. You can put together a group text and just sort of handle it that way, and everyone's going to see whose turn it is, and any issues can be handled that way, no problem. But again, in a larger setting, things go off the rails pretty easily and pretty quickly. It's much more difficult to coordinate the collective action of large numbers of people. And the book uses a very good example of this, I think, in terms of the difficulty that millions of voters faced in coordinating their decision-making in the 2016 Republican presidential nomination process. As you know, I'm sure, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination in 2016 and then the presidency. Interestingly, surveys showed at the start of the primary election season, so that's the process in which the candidates are competing to become the nominee before the general election. In the primary election process, Donald Trump had the support of about 30% of Republican voters. That was the most. No other candidate has as much or more than him. So you can look at that as, well, Trump had the plurality of support, not a majority, but the plurality. But you could also look at that as 30% of Republican voters wanted Donald Trump, 70% of Republican voters wanted somebody else. The problem they faced, the problem this anybody but Trump group, which was by far larger than the group supporting Trump, faced, was coordinating their efforts behind a single alternative to Trump. Surveys showed, so the same surveys that showed that Trump enjoyed the plurality of support, 30% of the Republican voters, more than anybody else, also showed, however, that in one-on-one Trump versus somebody else questions, Trump lost to several people. So the 30% of support that Trump had, that was his. The other 70% was spread across about 15 other potential nominees in the 2016 primary. So the problem that the party faced was coalescing behind any one of those nominees to take on Trump. If the choice was between Donald Trump and Texas Senator Ted Cruz, as you can see in the graphic, and it was in the text as well, Cruz was preferred handily over Trump. By about the same margin, Florida Senator Marco Rubio was preferred over Trump. By a lesser margin, but still a substantial margin, Ohio Governor John Kasich was preferred over Trump. If any one of those three individuals, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, or John Kasich, if the party had been able to come together around that person as the alternative to Trump and not spread their vote and dilute their votes across the others, Donald Trump would not have been the nominee. And the party would not have had a nominee that most of them didn't want. But they couldn't. There was no mechanism to coordinate their ability to coalesce around this single alternative to Donald Trump, so Donald Trump was the nominee. The larger the number, the more that you need formal institutions to solve these coordination problems. And the text talks about the difference between a string quartet versus a symphony orchestra. I'm kind of out of my league here in terms of either one of those. I believe a string quartet would be violin, viola, cello, and bass. Let's go with that. That's a small number of instruments, and those musicians can coordinate their efforts by playing off each other and just hearing what each other is doing, and they can stay together and play in time pretty well just on their own. But a symphony orchestra with dozens and dozens of instruments requires the existence of a single person whose only job is not to play an instrument, but to lead all of them and to coordinate all their efforts. And that person, of course, is the conductor. The political analogy would be the United States Senate versus the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members. That's a fairly large number, but it's still small enough that the Senate can proceed and conduct its business fairly informally. There aren't a whole lot of rules about Senate processes. The House of Representatives, however, has 4 times that many members, at 435. The House, in contrast to the Senate, has a lot of formal rules about how its committees will function and how its business will be processed. Again, the larger the number of participants involved, the greater the coordination problems are, and therefore the need for formal ways of doing things, institutions to solve coordination problems. The second collective action problem is known as the prisoner's dilemma. And the heart of the prisoner's dilemma is this. It's a choice between doing so from an individual standpoint, doing what you know you ought to do in the interest of the overall group versus defecting from that, knowing that that might be in your selfish interest, in your own individual best interests. And again, the larger the group we're talking about, the more likely it is that defections will happen because it's easier to get away with them. They'll go unnoticed. The classic example, and the text gets into this with the movie example, and I'll explain it in slightly different, but basically the same terms in terms of the logic of it, has to do with, imagine 2 criminals, Slim and Shorty. And why are their names Slim and Shorty? I have no idea. There you go. And imagine that Slim and Shorty have been accused of a crime, a bank robbery, let's say. And the police have some evidence against Slim and Shorty, and they did do it, but they know that the evidence, if they stick together and basically vouch for each other and are each other's alibis, they know the evidence isn't strong enough to convict either of them of the robbery. If they stick to a cover story that they've agreed upon going into this, they know that the worst they'll get is maybe a 6-month sentence for a weapons possession charge, but they're not going to go down for armed robbery. So Slim and Shorty, they're arrested, and before they're brought in for interrogations, they talk to each other and say, look, let's just stick with our story. You back me up, I'll back you up, and the worst that's going to happen is 6 months in jail, and neither one of us is going to take the fall for a bank robbery. But the police aren't stupid. They separate them. They interrogate them individually. And while they're separated, both Slim and Shorty start to wonder if the other's going to live up to their side of the agreement. And of course, the police are saying to Slim, you know what, Shorty's ratting you out for the whole thing, saying that you did it and he had nothing to do with it. And of course, the police are saying to Shorty the same thing. Yeah, Slim is talking he's singing like a canary. He's blaming the whole crime on you, and apparently, with that testimony, unless you have something to say, you're going to take the fall for the whole thing. You're going down. So think about the choices that Slim and Shorty face here in this 2x2 matrix. In this top cell up here, if they both stick to their cover story and they both cooperate, they both come out ahead. They both get just 6 months in jail. But Slim is not sure about what Shorty's going to do. Slim is like, well, that's Shorty. I mean, he is a criminal after all. He's not exactly an honest stand-up guy. If I cooperate, but he defects, then I'm going to take the fall for the entire crime. I'm going to spend 10 years in jail while he gets off free. Shorty, meanwhile, is thinking the exact same thing about Slim, who also knows to be a criminal. If Shorty cooperates, but Slim defects, then Shorty goes down for 10 years and Slim gets off for free. And they both can become so worried about what the other's going to do that what tends to happen is they both defect. They both renege on the agreement. They both end up in jail. They both sing. They both blame the other. So then the police have enough, the state has enough to convict both of them for the crime. They both go to jail for 5 years. They end up in this cell down here. This is an area of economics research and political science research known as game theory. It's a very simplistic game, but this is called the Nash equilibrium. It's where the game tends to settle at. And this is an example of the prisoner's dilemma. They're better off cooperating, but the incentive structure that confronts both of them leads them to both defect, even though they're both worse off by defecting than they would have been by cooperating, because they're unsure about what the other's going to do. They can't trust the other person. I want to show you a British game show version of exactly this, if I can pull it up here quickly. This is a British game show called The Golden Balls. And I'm just going to play it, and you can see how this goes.
Selling the cash, split or steal. You have 2 final golden balls each. They're not cash, they're not killers. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You each have a golden ball with the word steal written inside. I'll ask you to check your 2 golden balls to make sure you know which is the split ball and which is the steal ball. I will then ask you to make a conscious choice of choosing either the split or the steal ball. Neither of you will know what the other has chosen. If you both choose the split ball, you'll split today's jackpot of £10,405 and go home with £5,202.60. If one of you chooses the split ball and the other one chooses the steal ball, whoever chooses the steal ball steals the whole jackpot of £10,405. You go home with all that money. If you both choose the steal ball, you go home with nothing. You understand?
Yeah.
That's your decision. I'm going to ask you now to check your 2 golden balls to make sure you know which is split and which is steal. Be very careful not to show each other. Very careful. You know which is split and steal?
Yes.
Yes? Before I ask you to choose, I always give you a couple of minutes to chat about today's events.
Okay, well, I've been honest throughout the whole game, sweetheart, and I trusted you all the way through, and then, it's not a big amount, it's £5 each, for me that's going to do a lot for my family, and, I'm more than happy to go home.
I'll buy you a couple of dresses. Oh, sweetheart, I've got kids at the end of the day, and all I want to do is take them on a good holiday this year.
Well, you can, and I promise you can do that. And you
promise me.
Yeah, I promise you.
Promise me on your heart. Promise me on your heart.
On my heart. I've been honest. You've seen, I've been honest about the whole game. I have not lied about any amounts. I haven't lied about any killers. I'm honest about all the killers that I had.
Are you sure?
Yes.
100%.
100%.
100% promise. Swear on your heart.
100%. I swear on my heart that I'm going to split with you. Let's take on £5 each and take £5 to my family. That's what I really, really want to do.
Because I want to take it, you know, like to Disneyland.
You can do that. No, you're making me cry, please no. Okay.
Promise me.
Promise to split. I'll split. Someone's gone 100 miles an hour. God, it's different when you're on the show, isn't it, Jasper?
Nick Just, are you ready?
Yes.
Shelley? Sure?
Promise.
Shelley, Mukesh?
I've lived your life.
I've believed you, and I've trusted you, and I've been honest about the whole game.
Shelley, Mukesh, choose the split or the steel ball now and hold it. This is a serious question now. Are you happy with your choice?
Yes.
Are you happy with your choice?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Split or steal? Now, come on. You both came to steal. Come on, be honest. The other two were honest.
I love that. They looked in each other's eyes, they promised, they swore up and down they're going to help their families, help their kids, and they both tried to screw each other. They didn't trust each other. They would have had $5,000 each had they both cooperated, but instead they were greedy and selfish and didn't trust the other, and so they both ended up with nothing. Perfect. That's the prisoner's dilemma. If you want an example in government, here's one. Everybody knows, it's long been known, it's no secret to anyone that the Social Security program, one of the most popular government programs of the last 100 years, is in a lot of trouble. The baby boom generation is so large and is now in the retirement age. I'm going to be there myself in just a couple of years. So large that by the time the millennial generation gets to retirement age, the fund there won't be enough money left in it to fund it for your retirement. And so something's got to happen to reform Social Security. Something's got to be done to make to keep the program solvent, so that there is some retirement benefit there for when you get there. But the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, have very different ideas about how to reform Social Security, and both ideas are basically unpopular. The Democrats would rather increase taxes, Social Security taxes, to fund the program at a higher level rather than cutting benefits. Republicans don't like tax increases, so they would rather cut the benefits than increase taxes. Neither option is very popular among voters. Telling voters that your taxes are going to go up or your benefits are going to go down, neither position is particularly unpopular. And yet what the parties both ought to do is some blend of both, so that neither one is left holding the bag and getting all the blame for an unpopular choice. If they both do something, they increase taxes and cut benefits, some combination of the two, the program will at least be reformed in a way that it will continue to exist and it will remain solvent. But the Democrats want the Republicans to take the blame, wholesale blame, for failing to reform Social Security. They're refusing to cut benefits and trying to force Republicans into tax increases. Republicans do the opposite. They refuse to raise taxes and want to force the Democrats into unpopular benefit cuts. And so they refuse to settle on any kind of compromise between them. And as a result, they're both defecting. Nothing is being done, and Social Security continues towards insolvency. I'm going to retire within a couple years of making this video, and I'm not sure it's going to be there for me, never mind for you. There are two versions of the prisoner's dilemma problem. One is called free riding, and the other is called tragedy of the commons. And remember, both of these are versions or types of the prisoner's dilemma that we just talked about. Both of them involve the tension between what individuals might want to do in their own self-interest versus what they ought to do for the societal collective good. Let's first define what a collective good is. A good means an outcome or a product. And it can be a physical thing, it can be a highway that's constructed, it can be some sort of transportation or economic system, or it can be an intangible thing. An election outcome is a good. It's not a physical thing, but it's collective. Both of the things are collective in that they are the product of collective or group effort. The efforts of lots of people collectively are required to make them happen. Building a highway or electing someone to office requires the efforts of lots of people coordinated in some way. Another characteristic of a collective good, and this one's important, is that the good is non-excludable. It's available to all regardless of whether or not they helped to produce it. So hold on to that thought for a second, and we'll come up with an example on why that non-excludability factor is so important. This dirty beach is an example of a collective good, or you might call it a collective bad. It's a collective outcome that was produced by not any one person, but by the combined efforts of lots of people polluting the beach. Clean beaches which we could produce if we cleaned up the beach, would be another example of a collective good. So let's arrive at a collective agreement. Let's clean up the beach. Let's engage in beach cleanup day. I just looked online before I made this video, and it turns out that the Surfrider Foundation sponsors beach cleanup days. I think it's on the first Saturday of each month. I'm recording this in June. On June 1st, on June 17th, there's a meetup group that's going to go to various Encinitas beaches and clean up the beaches. So you guys have lots of opportunities to be involved in beach cleanup days. And if you do, it'll result in this: a clean beach. You might recognize this particular beach if you're in the North County, San Diego area. This is Swamis. This is just north of the steps that go down to the beach in Swamis. And I picked this particular picture because this section right here, just north of that, is my favorite part of the beach. I love it. So I would really like it if you all would take advantage of the Surfrider Foundation or the meetup group and go and clean up the Encinitas beaches, and especially pay attention to this one because it's my favorite. This is where the non-excludability problem comes up. Notice I said I hope you guys, all of you, go to beach cleanup day, because I don't really want to. I'd rather stay home and just be lazy that day, and then when you're done, I can go and enjoy a clean beach. That's the non-excludability problem. The clean beach, after you're done cleaning it up, thank you very much, by the way. After you're done cleaning it up, the clean beach is available to all, including me, regardless of whether they participated in the beach cleanup day. You can't force me to go to some section of Swamis that you didn't bother to clean up and say, hey, you're a slacker, you have to go to this dirty part of the beach. It's there for me, the clean part's there for me. So of course the temptation is to not participate, but to enjoy the beach anyway. That's the free rider problem. And I'm sure that you've seen this all over the place. Free riding is reaping the benefits of something despite not contributing to it. And the problem is that too much free riding jeopardizes the existence of the collective good. It threatens that it won't come into being in the first place. And once you start thinking of these things, examples are everywhere. If you attend a church, there's probably at some point in the service where there's an offering or a collection basket that goes around. And of course, these funds that are donated by the church members go toward doing all the things that churches are there to do in the first place, helping people out in times of need, for example, and doing the work of the church. And if you're going there, presumably you support that work, so of course everyone's contributing to the basket, right? No. A lot of people don't. Cheating on taxes is the same thing. I forget the number of dollars that the IRS estimates it loses annually by people cheating on taxes. We all want the things that our taxes pay for. We want a nation that's defended. We want functioning government and roads and highways, and we want all these things. But we also want other people to pay for it, not us. We'd rather cheat on our taxes than contribute honestly. For about 20 years, I listened to the number one preset on my radio dial has been NPR, National Public Radio. I listened to it for free instead of contributing to NPR. For some reason, about 5 years ago, my conscience finally got the best of me, and I became a contributing member to NPR. But apparently, only about 10% of the listeners to NPR contribute to the station. It's publicly funded radio. It's not commercially supported. The problem that NPR has is that anyone can put 89.5 on their radio dial, and the NPR signal in San Diego comes through, and you get to hear it. And you get to hear it whether you contributed to the station or not. So 90% of those who were listening to it decided not to. Why would you? I mean, other than it's the right thing to do. I'm sure you've all been involved in group projects at school at some level, and you've probably had that member in your group. Maybe you've been that member in your group who doesn't do his or her share, knowing that it's a group grade, someone else will step in and take up the slack, and you'll get the group grade, and isn't life wonderful? That's why I don't assign group work myself in classes. I don't really know how to deal with that problem. The other type of the prisoner's dilemma is known as the tragedy of the commons, and it's similar to free riding. They're both examples of the prisoner's dilemma. It's failure to abide by a collective agreement. It's defecting or reneging on the collective agreement out of one's own self-interest. The difference is, though, that tragedy of the commons pertains to a collective good that already exists. Free riding can fail to generate a collective good. Like if in group work in school, for example, if enough people free ride, the group project, say a group paper, is not going to be produced. There just won't be a paper. Tragedy of the commons involves a collective good that already exists, but is being destroyed bit by bit by people who are taking little chunks out of it. And no one chunk is the fatal blow necessarily. No one chunk is necessarily even noticeable, but it's the overall aggregate accumulated damage done by all the chunk that ruins the collective good. Environmental concerns typically reflect this. My one car isn't destroying the environment, but hundreds of millions of cars are. The text had an example of overfishing the oceans. No one fishing boat is destroying fish populations in the seas, but an abundance of fishing and overfishing over a number of years is. Any one idiot driving 85 miles an hour on the freeway, and if that was you today, I apologize, no offense. Any one person doing that, it's not great, but no one person makes the highways unsafe. Lots of people doing it, then you have a problem. Here's a gross example. I live in Encinitas, an area where there's lots of green belts, and it's really nice. It would be really nice to walk on those green belts if people picked up after their dogs. In fact, I never walk on the green belts because enough people don't pick up after their dogs, and it's a frickin' landmine walking through that place. Those are all examples of the tragedy of the commons. A major challenge to societies is how to deal with these problems of collective action. How are we going to do all the things that societies exist to do, to build transportation systems and a strong national defense and provide for a high quality education and safe foods and water and products? How are you going to coordinate the efforts that are required to do those things? And how are you going to prevent people from enjoying their benefits without contributing to their costs? Every society has to address these challenges, and there are basically four options available to societies for doing so. Two of them tend not to work in large-scale mass societies. They might work in small settings. They're not practical in mass societies. The first is anarchy, just really having no system or no rules, no particular way of doing things. Just things will sort themselves out. It'll just happen. People will make it happen. One example with this would be the collective good that I'm thinking of is boarding a bus in a relatively peaceful, organized fashion. There's no rule, there's no system, there's no manual. There isn't a list of rules at bus stations that say, here's the order in which people are going to get on the bus. You just know, and just do it. We sort of informally understand that the people who are there first tend to get on first. And if you showed up last, you're the last to get on. And of course, we also understand some exceptions to that. A woman who's pregnant or a person with lots of kids to take care of, a person with some sort of physical disability. Those people get to go to the front and get on first. Everybody knows that. Does everybody know that? No. There's probably some jerks out there that would violate those rules and would push a pregnant woman aside saying, I was here first, and get on the bus first. What happens to that person? Nothing really. They get the stink eye from everyone else on the bus, and maybe that's enough to convince them that they're a jackass and they shouldn't do that, or maybe they are a jackass and so that they're impervious to that kind of feedback. But the point is, there's no system for boarding a bus, and yet we manage to board buses throughout the country every day, every hour of every day, pretty well overall. Altruism is a second way. That's just counting on the goodness of our hearts to get things done, to contribute to the collective good. Going back to the roommate situation, maybe you have no formal rotation for who does the dishes, or who cleans up around the house, or who buys groceries. Maybe just kind of all count on each other to know that when you see a pile of dishes in the sink and you haven't done them for a while, you should do it, so just do it. That can work in small settings. It probably doesn't work in modern mass societies. We probably can't have a functional defense system counting on things just to sort themselves out, people to show up at the right place with the right supplies, with a plan to take on whatever threat we're facing. We probably can't just count on the goodness of their hearts to motivate people to engage in defending the country on a level required in modern mass societies. Which gets us to the ways that actually do work in modern mass societies. And there really are two. The class is going to focus on the second one, of course, but a competing way of creating collective goods is markets, using the profit motive to incentivize the production of collective goods. And in a second, I'll give you some examples of that. The fourth and final way, and of course the focus of this class being a class about government politics, is government, using the coercive power of the state to solve coordination problems, to require people to behave in a certain way and to contribute to the collective good, and punish those who refuse to, who renege or defect. This difference between markets and governments as ways of creating collective goods is a fundamental difference, an area of major disagreement between liberal and conservative political philosophies. So take, for example, 3 different collective goods that we all would like to see exist: affordable health care, quality education, and safe products. Conservatives would prefer market forces in all those things, and liberals would prefer a larger role for government in all those things. Conservatives would look to market forces to control the cost of market competition between competing firms to rein in the costs of health care. Liberals would look to government to regulate those costs and impose limits on those costs and actually fund those costs through insurance. In terms of education and high quality education, conservatives would lean towards private schools and charter schools and having school choice, and including choice about curriculum and local control over curricular choices. Things like teaching creationism along with evolution as scientific explanations of life, for example. Liberals would look more towards public schools, publicly funded schools that have national standards that are dictated by the government, which would rule out teaching creationism as science. In terms of how we know that the products that we use are safe, the water that and the foods that we drink and that we eat and the cars that we drive, etc., how do we know those things are safe? Conservatives would look towards market incentives and the damage done to a firm's reputation if they made unsafe products as a way to incentivize the creation of safe products. Liberals would look more to government standards for safety and regulatory bodies that ensure the safety. So this is not to say that one versus the other is correct. We could probably come up with a lot of different examples where in some ways market incentives are more effective than government regulations, and some ways where market incentives probably break down and we need government regulations. The point is, those are different ways of creating public goods, and preference for one or the other is one of the things that distinguishes between liberal and conservative political philosophies in American politics today. Again, the focus in this class is going to be government, although I want to bring back this market versus government distinction at various times throughout the class. Government as a solution to collective action problems amounts to government using its power to solve coordination problems, to decide that this is how things are going to be done, and here's who's going to do what, and to use the force of government, its coercive power, to force people to contribute to the collective good. So, I talked about cheating on taxes as a problem of free riding. The whole point of using government and the coercive power of government is to go after tax cheats, to compel people to not cheat in their taxes. We talked about the inadequacy of using anarchy or altruism to come up with an adequate defense. So during times when we actually really need a lot of people to defend the country, we rely on a draft. We don't give people the option of maybe I'll serve or maybe I won't. People are drafted and then have to serve. And government punishes those who renege on those commitments. Combating collective action entails some costs. And the text talks about these things in terms of a trade-off between 2 different types of costs. So again, think about this in terms of collective action involves providing a group with benefits, national defense, a functioning education system, product safety, and so on, that the group couldn't achieve on its own. Collective action is required. But doing so, engaging in collective action, entails some costs. The first kind of cost that the text talks about are transaction costs, which amounts to the time and the energy and the effort required to make a collective decision, as well as the opportunity costs, what else you could have done with that time and the energy. Conformity costs are those borne by the losers in a decision, those who would have preferred a different outcome, a different collective action, but they still have to contribute to the collective good that they didn't want in the first place. And I think maybe a couple of examples of transaction versus conformity costs will make the difference between them a little clearer. And also, not just that they're different, but they tend to involve a trade-off between the two of them. Democracies tend to have very high transaction costs. Democratically deciding how things are going to be done is a lot of work. Holding elections to install people in power involves months and months of campaigns, and coordinated efforts by lots of people and candidates running and lots of expense and decision making, and it plays out over a long period of time. But those actions in the elections produce an outcome, and pretty much by definition, at least a majority of the people involved got what they wanted. Not everybody. There are some conformity costs. The people who are on the losing side of the election didn't get what they wanted, yet they were still involved in all that went on in the election to some extent, either voting or whatever. Dictatorship, on the other hand, has much lower transaction costs. A dictatorship involves, in its simplest form, one single individual saying, here's what we're going to do. This is the policy. This is what's going to happen. So the transaction costs in arriving at that decision are much lower. The conformity costs are potentially a lot higher. If that happens to be an unpopular decision, then large majorities, maybe almost everyone won't like it, but there's not much they can do. They live in a dictatorship. So I hope that makes sense. Here's another example that might make it make a little more sense. Every now and then the CSU decides to raise your fees to make it more expensive to go to school here. The process by which that happens involves pretty low transaction costs, but pretty high conformity costs. Basically, student fee increases are decided on by the Board of Trustees of the CSU. It's 20-something people, I believe, who meet in Long Beach, and they discuss the need for fee increases and decide to do them. It's not that there aren't any transaction costs. I mean, there are still 20 people who have to get together and hash this out and decide whether to increase fees, and if so, by how much, and the process of rolling them out and all that stuff. But it's 20-something people. So the transaction costs are pretty low. The conformity costs are pretty high, though. I would imagine that a large majority of students throughout the 23, I think it is, campuses of the CSU find those increases unpopular, and if given a vote, would vote against them. But you don't have a vote. If you want to go to school here, you got to pay the fees, and that's what the fees are. What the Board of Trustees decide they are. So low transaction costs to make a decision to raise your fees, but pretty high conformity costs. Imagine how different it would be if, instead of giving the Board of Trustees the power to make those decisions, we actually put it to a vote of the students. The transaction costs involved in raising fees would be pretty high. It would be pretty hard to convince a majority of the many thousands of students across the 23 CSU campuses that it was a good idea to raise their fees. If you could achieve that, though, if you could pay those very high transaction costs, and a majority did decide to raise fees, the conformity costs would have been lower, because the majority would have said, okay, we need to do this. I hope that makes some sense in terms of the trade-offs between those two kinds of costs. A few closing thoughts on some terminology. You'll see the terms private and public and collective goods in the text. And there's some overlap here, which is where the term collective goods comes in. Private goods refer to things that you buy and you consume yourself. So your car, your house, your food. Those are things that you supply for yourself. Public goods, however, are supplied collectively through tax dollars, for example, and are non-excludable. So the freeways and roads that we drive, the defense, the functioning economic system, our communication system, those things are public goods, and they're non-excludable. The confusion arises with the fact that some goods are mixed. Some goods have elements of both private and public in them. Public education is an example. It's a public good, sort of by definition, but there are private benefits to that. For example, the graduates who emerge from a public education system. You, when you graduate from Cal State San Marcos with a degree in whatever, that degree is, in a sense, a private benefit that you have. So public education is kind of a mix. To kind of sidestep the confusion between public and private goods, the text is going to really differentiate between private goods, which are individually supplied, and what they'll call collective goods that are collectively supplied. And that way you kind of, so the question is really whether or not the good is supplied through the product of collective action, which is subjected to all the problems of collective action, coordination, prisoner's dilemma, free riding, tragedy of the commons, all that stuff, or whether it's simply privately supplied. So just a couple notes on terminology. And then lastly, and this is setting up where we're going in the next section of the class. The Founding Fathers didn't use the language of collective action. This terminology didn't exist then. They weren't political scientists per se, but they had very keen insights into the nature of these problems, and they clearly recognized the existence of these problems in the states. The challenge they faced was they saw tremendous coordination and prisoner's dilemma problems in the 13 states after the nation's founding under the Articles of Confederation. And they recognized very early on, particularly Alexander Hamilton recognized very early on, that the fundamental problem that the nation faced was the lack of a strong central government to rein in those states and to solve the coordination and prisoner's dilemma problems. So the obvious answer to that dilemma then, or that problem, is to empower a central government. That's no easy task. It's not easy, it wasn't easy to convince 13 entities, states, that had sort of considered themselves sovereigns under themselves to surrender some of their sovereignty to a larger overarching national government. That was not an easy sell, and we'll get into that in the next section. But it was the obvious answer to the problem of coordination problems and prisoner's dilemma problems among the states. But then there's the other side of the problem. How do you hold that more powerful national government in check? Because the founders, they didn't want tyranny either. They had existed under that, under British rule. They didn't want that. So we'll take on that dilemma and those questions in the next section.